August 26, 1346. A ridge near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in northern France. King Edward III of England stood beside a windmill, watching the French army appear on the horizon like a storm gathering strength. Below him, spread across rising ground broken by terraces and small copses, his army of roughly 12,000 men waited in 3 divisions. At the front, commanded by his 16-year-old son, the Black Prince. Behind them, the reserve divisions under the Earls of Northampton and Arundel. And at the centre of each division, something that would change European warfare forever. 7,000 English and Welsh longbowmen, each carrying a 6-foot bow of yew wood and sheaves of cloth-yard arrows. The French didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness the death of an era. The age of mounted cavalry dominance was ending, and it would end here in a muddy field in northern France, under a rain of arrows so thick that witnesses would compare it to falling snow. The 100 Years' War had begun 9 years earlier, in 1337, when King Philip VI of France moved to confiscate Edward's territories in Gascony. Edward's response was to claim the French throne itself through his mother, Isabella of France. What followed was a series of raids and naval battles that had so far favoured neither side decisively. But Edward had been planning something bigger, an invasion that would strike at the heart of French power and force Philip to meet him in open battle. On July 12, 1346, Edward landed near Cherbourg with an invasion force of roughly 14,000 men aboard an armada of 750 ships. It was the largest amphibious operation Europe had seen, a logistical marvel that wouldn't be matched until the Normandy landing 6 centuries later. The army that came ashore was unlike anything the French had faced before, not because of its size, the French could field far larger armies, but because of its composition and organisation. At the core were about 4,000 men-at-arms, knights and heavily armoured soldiers who would traditionally fight on horseback. But Edward had learned something from watching Scottish armies defeat English cavalry at Bannockburn and other battles. Dismounted men-at-arms fighting on foot with shortened lances and swords were far more effective at holding defensive positions than mounted knights trying to charge uphill or across broken ground. Supporting these men-at-arms were roughly 10,000 archers, most of them English yeomen trained from childhood in the use of the longbow. And this is where the revolution lay. Not in some technological breakthrough or tactical genius, though Edward certainly had that, but in the simple fact that England had spent decades building a military culture around the longbow. By law, every able-bodied Englishman was required to practice archery regularly. Village greens across England had archery butts where men practiced after church on Sundays. The minimum practice range was 200 yards. Boys started training as young as 7, building the immense upper body strength required to draw a warbow. The longbow itself was a marvel of simplicity. 6 feet tall, made from a single stave of yew wood, preferably from trees grown in mountainous regions where slow growth created dense, flexible wood. The outer sapwood provided elasticity, while the inner heartwood gave compressive strength. The combination created a bow that could generate draw weights of 100 to 180 pounds. To put that in perspective, a modern recreational bow typically has a draw weight of 30 to 50 pounds. Drawing a warbow required the strength to lift and hold that weight at arm's length while aiming. It was brutal, exhausting work that left distinctive skeletal deformities in the shoulders and arms of longbowmen, marks that archaeologists can identify in medieval remains to this day. But the payoff was devastating. A longbow could shoot an arrow up to 300 yards, though the effective combat range was closer to 200 yards. More importantly, a trained archer could loose 6 to 12 arrows per minute, far faster than any other ranged weapon of the era. Compare that to the crossbow, the weapon of choice for most continental armies. The crossbow was powerful, capable of punching through armour with devastating force, but it was also slow. A crossbowman could fire perhaps 2 to 3 bolts per minute, and that was with a well-maintained weapon and plenty of practice. The crossbow's advantage was that it required far less training. You could hand a crossbow to a peasant, teach him the basics in a few weeks, and have a reasonably effective soldier. But on the battlefield, when arrows were flying and men were dying, rate of fire mattered more than ease of training. Edward's strategy for the campaign was simple and brutal. He would conduct a chevauchée, a destructive raid designed to demonstrate French weakness and provoke Philip into battle. The English army marched south from their landing site, burning towns, destroying crops, and looting everything of value. Caen, the cultural and political centre of northwestern Normandy, was stormed on July 26th. More than 5,000 French soldiers and civilians were killed. The city was looted for 5 days. The message was clear. Edward could strike anywhere he wanted, and Philip couldn't stop him. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical destruction. By ravaging French territory with impunity, Edward was demonstrating that Philip couldn't protect his own kingdom. For a medieval king, whose legitimacy rested largely on his ability to defend his realm and lead his knights to victory, this was an existential threat. Philip had no choice but to respond. He assembled an army in Paris, somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 men according to various accounts, though the exact number is disputed by historians. The force included roughly 12,000 mounted knights and men-at-arms, the flower of French nobility. Every great house in France sent its sons: the Count of Alençon, brother of the king, the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, and perhaps most striking, King John of Bohemia, a 50-year-old warrior who had been blind for a decade but still insisted on leading his troops into battle. Supporting these knights were approximately 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, professional mercenaries hired for their expertise. The Genoese were famous throughout Europe as the finest crossbowmen available. They fought in organised companies, protected by large shields called pavises that were carried by assistants. 3 crossbowmen could shelter behind a single pavis, taking turns to shoot while protected from enemy missiles. It was an effective system that had served them well in countless battles across Italy and the Mediterranean. But as the French army assembled and began its pursuit of the English, problems were already emerging. The sheer size of the force made it difficult to manage. Units arrived at different times, the baggage train carrying supplies, ammunition, and those critical pavises for the crossbowmen stretched for miles along medieval roads. Communication was difficult, coordination nearly impossible. As Edward's army marched north toward the Somme River, hoping to link up with Flemish allies, Philip's massive force followed. The English were in danger of being trapped against the river. Philip had ordered all bridges destroyed, and the Somme was too deep to ford in most places. But Edward's scouts found a tidal ford called Blanche Tac, a place where the river could be crossed at low tide. On August 24th, the English army waded across chest-deep in water under fire from French troops on the far bank. The longbowmen went first, shooting as they advanced through the water, suppressing the French defenders long enough for the rest of the army to cross. It was a costly crossing, but successful, and it gave Edward something crucial: the ability to choose his battlefield. 2 days later, on August 26th, he found it, a ridge running roughly north to south between the villages of Crécy and Wadicourt. The position was ideal for defence. The ridge sloped gradually upward from the south, where the French would approach. The slope was broken by natural terraces that would disrupt any cavalry charge. On the right flank near Crécy sat a forest that protected that side from being outflanked. On the left near Wadicourt the ground became marshy and difficult for horses, and behind the ridge another forest where Edward could place his supply wagons and horses, since his entire army would fight on foot. Edward spent August 26th preparing his position. His men dug pits and trenches to break up cavalry charges. They hammered sharpened wooden stakes into the ground at angles, creating a primitive palisade, and most importantly, they organised into their battle formations. The Black Prince commanded the forward division on the right, roughly 4,000 men including 2,000 archers, positioned in a wedge formation that jutted forward from the main line. The Earl of Northampton commanded the 2nd Division on the left, with another 2,000 archers in a similar wedge, and Edward himself commanded the reserve, positioned on the highest point of the ridge where he could see the entire battlefield. The archers were deployed in what medieval chroniclers called a harrow formation, a series of wedges or chevrons that allowed them to shoot without hitting their own men and to create overlapping fields of fire. Any enemy approaching the English line would be shot at from multiple angles. As the afternoon wore on, the French army began arriving. They had marched hard to catch the English, and they arrived in disorder. The first units came up the road from Abbeville around 3 in the afternoon. More units continued arriving for hours. There was no unified deployment, no careful organisation of the line. Knights arrived, saw the English position, and simply moved into place wherever they could find space. Philip's senior commanders advised waiting until the next day. The army was tired. The baggage train hadn't arrived. The crossbowmen didn't have their pavises, They should rest, organise properly and attack in the morning when everyone was fresh and ready. But Philip's nobles were eager for battle. They had been chasing the English for weeks. Now the enemy was cornered, outnumbered at least 2-1, probably more. French knights had been the dominant military force in Europe for centuries. These English archers, peasants with wooden bows, couldn't possibly stand against armoured cavalry. The very suggestion was insulting. Around 4 in the afternoon, a sudden rainstorm swept across the battlefield. The English archers quickly unstrung their bows, removing the bowstrings and tucking them under their leather caps or inside their clothing to keep them dry. This was standard procedure, something every archer learned early in his training. Bowstrings made of hemp or linen would stretch when wet, reducing the bow's power and making it less accurate. The Genoese crossbowmen had no such option. Crossbows couldn't be unstrung without tools and considerable effort. The composite construction of many crossbows using wood, horn and sinew held together with glue made them vulnerable to moisture. As the rain soaked their weapons, the strings began to stretch and the glue-laminated arms began to weaken. Modern tests have shown that even waxed crossbow strings can lose significant power when wet, and the draw mechanism becomes harder to operate as wooden components swell. The rain passed quickly, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes of heavy downpour followed by clearing skies, but the damage was done. As the sun emerged, now low in the western sky, it shone directly in the faces of the French forces and into the backs of the English, another advantage for Edward's army. Around 5 in the afternoon, with the sun in their eyes and their crossbows weakened by rain, the Genoese crossbowmen were ordered to advance. They moved forward in formation, professional and disciplined despite being exhausted from the march and lacking their protective shields. According to Jean Froissart, the medieval chronicler who interviewed survivors from both sides, the Genoese advanced to within range and loosed their first volley of bolts at the English position. What happened next shocked everyone present. The English archers, who had been resting on the ground to conserve their strength, rose to their feet in perfect formation. They had restrung their bows during the rain's passing, and the strings were dry. They drew their weapons in unison, and the sky darkened. Witnesses described it as looking like snow falling. A cloud of arrows, thousands of them, arcing high into the air and then plunging down onto the Genoese position with a sound like hail on a roof. The mathematics of this moment are staggering. 7,000 archers, each capable of shooting 6 to 10 arrows per minute. Even at the conservative rate of 6 arrows per minute, that's 42,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds. Some historians estimate that 500,000 arrows were shot during the battle. The sky wouldn't just darken, it would become nearly black with missiles. The Genoese had been outranged. Their crossbows, weakened by rain, could barely reach 200 yards. The English longbows, shooting downhill with dry strings, were hitting them from nearly 300 yards away. And the rate of fire was catastrophic. For every bolt a crossbowman could shoot, an English archer could loose 3 to 6 arrows. The Genoese tried to advance, tried to get within effective range, but arrows were plunging into their ranks continuously. Men fell, others were wounded. Horses, because some crossbowmen rode to battle even if they fought on foot, were hit and panicked. The formation began to waver. Contemporary accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Some say the Genoese managed only 1 or 2 volleys before falling back. Others suggest they never reached effective range at all. But all accounts agree on what happened when they began to retreat. The French knights, massed behind the crossbowmen and eager to attack, saw them falling back. To the nobles, raised in a culture that prized individual courage and glory above all else, this looked like cowardice. These foreign mercenaries were running from peasants with bows. It was intolerable. According to Froissart, King Philip himself shouted, "Kill me those scoundrels, for they stop up our road without any reason." Whether Philip actually gave that order, or whether the knights simply charged forward in frustration and anger, the result was the same. French cavalry crashed into the retreating Genoese. In the confusion and rage, many crossbowmen were cut down by their own allies. The commander of the Genoese, Otondoria, was reportedly killed by French knights. The crossbowmen were scattered, their cohesion destroyed, many of them dead or wounded. And now the knights, having cleared their own front line through slaughter, found themselves advancing uphill toward the English position in complete disorder. This was the moment when the longbow truly announced itself as the dominant weapon of the age. The first wave of French knights, led by the Count of Alençon, charged forward. They were magnificent, armoured head to toe in the finest steel plate available, riding massive destrier war horses bred specifically for combat. Their lances were 12 feet long, tipped with steel points that could punch through armour. Their shields bore the arms of noble houses stretching back centuries. They were the best warriors money could train, and they were convinced of their invincibility. The English archers drew and released, not in ragged volleys but in devastating continuous fire. Arrows filled the air constantly, a river of death that poured down onto the advancing knights. Modern tests with replica longbows have shown what those arrows could do. A cloth-yard shaft, roughly 3 feet long, tipped with a bodkin point, a narrow steel spike designed to penetrate armour, could punch through mail at 200 yards. At close range, under 100 yards, it could pierce plate armour, though this wasn't guaranteed. But the archers weren't relying on individual arrows to penetrate armour. They were relying on volume. Imagine being a knight in that charge. You're riding uphill in armour that weighs 60 to 80 pounds. Your horse is labouring under your weight plus its own armour. The ground is uneven, broken by those terraces and ditches the English dug, and arrows are hitting you continuously, not one or two, but dozens. Most bounce off your armour, true, but some find gaps, the joints at the elbows and knees where plates meet, the vision slits in your helmet. Your horse, which is less well armoured than you are, especially on its flanks and hindquarters. An arrow strikes your horse in the haunch. The animal screams and rears. You fight to stay in the saddle, but another arrow hits your shoulder joint. The impact doesn't penetrate, but the force nearly knocks you off balance. Your horse goes down, an arrow in its neck. You fall, 80 pounds of armour and weapons pulling you to the ground. And around you, dozens of other knights are falling too. Horses stumbling over other fallen horses. Knights trying to advance on foot in full armour up a muddy slope while arrows continue to rain down. The French made it worse for themselves through sheer determination. When the first wave faltered and fell back, a second wave charged forward, then a third. According to most accounts, the French, knights charged at least 15 times during the battle, possibly as many as 16. Each charge had to push through the wreckage of the previous one. Dead horses, dying men, broken lances and shields, and all the while, the arrows kept coming. Some French knights did reach the English line. These were the bravest, the strongest, the luckiest. They crashed into the English men-at-arms, and fierce hand-to-hand combat erupted. But they reached the line in small groups, disordered and exhausted, without the mass and momentum that made cavalry charges effective. The English men-at-arms, fresh and fighting on foot with good footing, cut them down. The Black Prince's division, on the right of the English line, bore the brunt of these attacks. The 16-year-old prince fought bravely, and at one point the situation became desperate enough that a knight was sent to King Edward requesting reinforcements. Edward, watching from his position on the ridge, famously asked if his son was dead or wounded. When told the prince was fine but hard-pressed, Edward replied that the boy should earn his spurs, that he should win the glory of the fight himself. The prince held. His men-at-arms stood firm, and the archers on his flanks continued their methodical slaughter of anyone who came within range. Among the French nobles who died that day was King John of Bohemia. His story deserves special attention because it encapsulates both the medieval martial ideal and its absolute failure in the face of massed archery. John had been blind for a decade, since contracting ophthalmia during a crusade in Lithuania in 1336. But he was still a king, still a warrior, and he had answered Philip's call to arms. When the battle began, and it became clear the French were attacking, John asked his knights where his son Charles was. They told him they thought Charles was fighting somewhere in the melee. John then made his decision. He ordered his knights to lead him into battle. Because he was blind and would become separated in the chaos, they tied the reins of their horses to his, creating a linked chain. And then this 50-year-old blind king charged into battle at Crécy. According to the Bohemian Chronicle, when told the battle was lost and he should flee, John replied, "God forbid that a Bohemian king should run away. Instead, take me to the place where the noise of battle is loudest." The next day, John's body was found on the battlefield, still surrounded by his knights, all of them dead, their horses still tied together. Legend says that Edward the Black Prince was so moved by this display of courage that he adopted John's emblem, 3 ostrich feathers, and his motto, Ich dien, I serve, as his own. Whether this story is true or not, it became one of the most famous incidents of the battle. But John's courage, however admirable, was also a perfect illustration of why the old ways of warfare were dying. Individual heroism, martial prowess, nobility of spirit. None of it mattered when you were charging uphill into thousands of arrows. The battle continued until well after dark. Some accounts say it went on until nearly midnight. Wave after wave of French attacks, each one breaking against the English defensive position like waves against a cliff. Eventually the French stopped coming. They had lost somewhere between 10,000 and 14,000 men, according to various estimates, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. What is certain is that the casualties were catastrophic. Roughly 1,500 French knights and nobles were confirmed dead. The Count of Alençon, King Philip's brother, killed. King John of Bohemia, dead. The Count of Flanders, dead. The Count of Blois, dead. Dozens of other nobles and knights, the elite of French society, slaughtered in a single afternoon. English casualties were somewhere between 100 and 300 men. The disparity is almost unbelievable, but it was confirmed by multiple sources from both sides. Edward lost less men at Crécy than he had lost crossing the Somme 2 days earlier. The French nobles couldn't understand what had happened. How had they lost? They outnumbered the English at least 2 to 1. They had the finest cavalry in Europe. They had courage, training, the best armour and weapons available, and they had been massacred by peasants with bows. The French interpreted the battle as evidence of English treachery or unnatural advantage. The longbow was characterised as an unchivalrous weapon. It allowed common men to kill nobles from a distance without facing them in honourable combat. For the English, Crécy was proof that their military reforms were working. The combination of dismounted men-at-arms, defensive position, and massed longbow fire had created a tactical system that could defeat numerically superior forces. But Crécy was more than just a tactical victory. It was a revolution in military affairs. For nearly 3 centuries since the development of the stirrup and heavy cavalry in the early Middle Ages, mounted knights had dominated European battlefields. Infantry were considered secondary at best, useful for sieges and holding ground, but not capable of defeating cavalry in open battle. Crécy shattered that assumption. It demonstrated that well-trained infantry, properly deployed and supported by overwhelming missile fire, could not only defeat cavalry, but could utterly destroy them. The implications rippled across Europe. Within years, every major power was trying to recruit and train longbowmen. But they would discover what England already knew. Longbowmen couldn't be created quickly. The weapon itself was simple enough to manufacture. But training someone to draw a 150-pound bow required years, starting in childhood. You couldn't hand a longbow to an adult and expect him to use it effectively. The physical development had to begin early, building the specific muscles and skeletal adaptations needed. France never succeeded in creating longbow companies to match England's. They tried, but the cultural and institutional frameworks weren't there. Instead, they eventually turned to firearms, which had a similar advantage to the crossbow. They could be learned relatively quickly by untrained soldiers, but that was still decades in the future. In the immediate aftermath of Crécy, the military balance in Western Europe had shifted dramatically. Edward capitalised on his victory by marching north to besiege Calais, the port city on the English Channel. Without a field army capable of challenging him, Philip couldn't relieve the siege. Calais held out for nearly a year, but eventually hunger forced its surrender in August 1347. England now had a permanent foothold in France, a heavily fortified port that could serve as a base for future operations. Calais would remain English for more than 2 centuries, not returning to French control until 1558. The Battle of Crécy established patterns that would define English military success for generations. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, Edward the Black Prince, now an experienced commander, would use essentially the same tactics to defeat another French army and capture King John II of France. 59 years later, at Agincourt in 1415, King Henry V would deploy longbowmen in defensive positions and watch them slaughter French cavalry trying to charge through muddy fields. Each time, French nobles charged bravely into arrow storms and died in massive numbers. Each time they blamed the weapon, the weather, the terrain, anything except the fundamental fact that their tactical doctrine had become obsolete. Eventually the French learned. They stopped charging English longbowmen frontally. They started using artillery more effectively. They adapted their armour and tactics, and they developed pike formations that could stand up to cavalry, without needing the rate of fire that longbows provided. By the time the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, the longbow's dominance was already waning. Firearms were improving, pike squares were becoming standard. The tactical innovations that had made Crécy possible were being countered and surpassed. But for more than half a century after that August day in 1346, the English longbow was the most feared weapon on European battlefields. And it all started at Crécy. The technical aspects of the longbow's effectiveness deserve closer examination, because they explain why it was so devastating in skilled hands. A warbow with a draw weight of 150 pounds stores roughly 100 joules of energy when fully drawn. When released, most of that energy transfers to the arrow, launching it at speeds of up to 180 feet per second. A cloth-yard arrow, the standard length used in war, weighed roughly 2 to 3 ounces, depending on the type of head attached. The most common arrowhead types were bodkins, narrow steel spikes designed to penetrate armour, broad heads, wider blades designed to cause massive bleeding in unarmoured targets, and barbed heads that were difficult to remove from wounds. For battles like Crécy, most arrows would have had bodkin points because the primary targets were armoured men. The effective range of a longbow is a subject of some debate among historians and archery experts. Maximum range, shooting at a high angle, could reach 300 to 400 yards under ideal conditions. But accuracy at that range was minimal. You were shooting at an area, not a specific target. Effective combat range, where an archer could reasonably expect to hit a man-sized target, was closer to 150 to 200 yards. At Crécy, the archers were shooting mostly at massed formations, so precision wasn't critical. As long as your arrow landed somewhere in the charging mass of knights and horses, it was doing its job. The rate of fire was what made the longbow truly devastating. Modern tests with replica bows show that an experienced archer can maintain a rate of 6 to 8 arrows per minute for extended periods, with brief bursts of 10 to 12 arrows per minute possible. Some extraordinary archers might achieve even higher rates for short periods, though fatigue quickly becomes a limiting factor. Drawing a 150-pound bow is exhausting work. Your back, shoulders, and arms are under enormous strain with each shot. After 10 or 15 minutes of sustained shooting, even the strongest archer will slow down. This is why archers were typically deployed in large numbers and in rotating positions. While one group was shooting, others could rest and retrieve arrows from the supply wagons or from the battlefield itself. Accounts from Crécy mention archers venturing forward during lulls in the fighting to pull arrows from bodies and the ground, recycling them for continued use. Each archer typically carried 60 to 72 arrows in his quiver at the start of battle. At 6 arrows per minute, that's 10 to 12 minutes of sustained shooting. After that, he needed resupply. The English supply train at Crécy would have contained hundreds of thousands of additional arrows in wagons behind the line. The logistics of arrow production and supply were as important to English military success as the training of the archers themselves. The arrows themselves required significant resources to produce. The shafts were typically made from ashwood, though other woods could be used. They had to be straight, smooth, and consistent in weight and balance. The fletching, the feathers at the rear that stabilized the arrow in flight, was typically goose feathers, carefully cut and attached. The arrowheads were forged from steel, a skilled metalworking task, and each arrow had to be carefully inspected and tested because a flawed arrow could break when shot, potentially injuring the archer. England developed an entire industry around arrow production. By the late 1400s, during the height of longbow use, England was importing yew wood from across Europe, and even from as far as the Baltic and Mediterranean regions to meet the demand for bowmaking. Arrow production was similarly industrialized, with dedicated workshops producing thousands of arrows per week. Compare this to the crossbow. While crossbows were powerful and accurate, they had significant limitations. The draw weight of a late medieval crossbow could be 300 to 1,000 pounds, much higher than a longbow. But all that power had to be stored in a much shorter draw length, and the mechanism required to draw such heavy weights made the weapon slow and mechanically complex. There were several methods for spanning, drawing, a crossbow. The simplest was a stirrup at the front that you placed your foot in while using both hands and your body weight to pull the string back. This worked for lighter crossbows but was impractical for heavy war crossbows. Heavier crossbows used mechanical aids, a belt and hook system where you attached a hook to the string and used your legs to draw it, a windlass, a cranking mechanism that could draw even the heaviest bows, or a goat's foot lever system. All of these mechanisms added weight, complexity, and time to each shot. Even the fastest crossbowman was limited to perhaps 3 shots per minute, and that was with a well-maintained weapon under ideal conditions. The crossbow's advantages were accuracy and penetration at shorter ranges, plus the fact that it required much less training to use effectively. You could train a crossbowman in weeks or months. Training a longbowman required years. The French had chosen crossbows largely for this reason. They didn't have the longbow tradition that England had developed, and they needed ranged weapons that could be deployed by hired mercenaries who might not have been training since childhood. But at Crécy, all the crossbow's advantages were nullified. The rain weakened their weapons, the lack of pavesers left them exposed, and the sheer volume of English arrow fire overwhelmed them before they could effectively engage. The psychological impact of facing massed longbow fire cannot be overstated. Imagine being in that first wave of French cavalry. You've trained your entire life for mounted combat. You're wearing armour that cost a fortune, more than most people earn in a lifetime. You're riding a horse that was bred and trained specifically for war, an animal worth more than a peasant's house. You're the apex predator of medieval warfare, the armoured knight. And then you charge, and the sky turns dark with arrows. They come down like rain, like hail, thousands of them, so many that you can't track individual missiles. They hit your armour with sharp cracks. Most bounce off, but some don't. An arrow glances off your pauldron. The shoulder armour with enough force to bruise even through the padding underneath. Another hits your horse. The animal stumbles. Around you, other knights are going down. Horses screaming, men shouting, and the arrows keep coming. There's no pause, no break in the onslaught, just a continuous stream of death falling from the sky. And here's the truly terrifying part. You can see the archers. They're right there, a few hundred yards away. Peasants in simple clothing with wooden bows. You're supposed to be able to ride them down, to scatter them like leaves before a storm. That's what cavalry does to infantry, but you can't reach them. The ground is broken. Your horse can barely maintain its footing. Arrows keep hitting, and when you finally close to within 100 yards, 50 yards, the arrow fire intensifies. Because now the archers are shooting at close range, where every shot hits, and the force of impact is devastating. Several contemporary accounts mention the sound of the battle, the thunder of thousands of arrows in flight, the screams of wounded horses, the crash of armoured men falling to the ground, the shouts and war cries. Jean Froissart describes the English archers shooting so fast and so continuously that it sounded like a single sustained roar. The psychological impact wasn't limited to the French soldiers in that battle. News of Crécy spread across Europe rapidly. Within months, every court and every military commander knew what had happened. The finest cavalry in Christendom, led by their king, outnumbering their enemies by at least 2 to 1, had been destroyed by archers. Peasant infantry had defeated noble cavalry. The implications were revolutionary and terrifying to the aristocratic classes, who had built their social position partly on their role as warriors. But to understand why Crécy happened the way it did, we need to understand the broader context of late medieval warfare. The 14th century was a period of significant military innovation across Europe. The English had learned hard lessons from their wars in Scotland, where Scottish pike formations had repeatedly defeated English cavalry. The Swiss were developing their own pike tactics that would eventually make them the most feared infantry in Europe. Gunpowder weapons were beginning to appear on battlefields, though they were still primitive and unreliable, and everywhere, the costs of warfare were escalating. Armour was becoming more sophisticated and more expensive. The full plate armour that would characterise the late 14th and 15th centuries was just beginning to appear. Training and maintaining professional soldiers, whether knights or mercenaries, was increasingly costly, and the logistics of moving and supplying large armies were becoming more complex as armies grew larger. England's solution to these challenges was to build their military system around a weapon that was cheap to manufacture, highly effective in trained hands, and supported by a mandatory training system that created a large pool of skilled archers. The longbow itself cost relatively little to make compared to armour or weapons for men-at-arms. The arrows were cheap to produce in bulk, and the training was built into English society through laws requiring regular archery practice. France had taken a different path. They relied heavily on their mounted nobility, supported by hired mercenary infantry, mostly crossbowmen. This gave them flexibility and meant they didn't need to maintain a large permanent army. But it also meant that when they faced an enemy, that had specifically developed tactics and weapons to counter cavalry, they were vulnerable. At Crécy, all of these factors came together. The English had chosen excellent defensive ground, had deployed their forces intelligently, and had the tactical discipline to execute their plan. The French arrived disorganized, attacked piecemeal, and repeatedly tried to use cavalry charges against a defensive position specifically designed to defeat cavalry. The result was inevitable. After Crécy, Edward continued campaigning in France. The siege of Calais lasted until August 1347 and ended with the city's surrender. The famous story of the burghers of Calais, where 6 leading citizens offered to sacrifice themselves to save the city, comes from this siege. Edward initially wanted to execute them but was persuaded by his wife, Queen Philippa, to show mercy. The capture of Calais gave England a permanent base in France, a fortified port that could be easily supplied and reinforced from across the Channel. For the next 2 centuries, Calais would serve as England's gateway to continental campaigns. Its loss to France in 1558, during the reign of Queen Mary I, would be considered a national disaster, but Crécy's immediate impact was strategic as much as tactical. The French had lost a significant portion of their military leadership. 1,500 knights and nobles dead meant 1,500 families in mourning, 1,500 estates without their lords, 1,500 gaps in the military and political structure of France. Some of these losses were more significant than others. The Count of Alençon, Philip's brother, was not just a military commander but a political ally and advisor. His death was a personal and political blow to Philip. King John of Bohemia, while not French, was an ally whose death weakened French diplomatic relationships with other European powers. The psychological impact on French morale was enormous. Their king had led the army personally and had been defeated. Their best knights had charged repeatedly and been slaughtered. The weapons and tactics they had relied on for centuries had proven inadequate. The English, meanwhile, gained enormous confidence from the victory. Edward had proven his tactical genius. The Black Prince had won his spurs in combat. The longbowmen had demonstrated their value. English military reputation surged across Europe. The 10 years following Crécy saw continued but smaller-scale campaigning in France. Both sides were exhausted and dealing with the catastrophic effects of the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1348 and killed anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population. Warfare became less intensive during the plague years, simply because both sides lacked the manpower to field large armies. But when major combat resumed, the patterns established at Crécy repeated. At the Battle of Poitiers on September 19th, 1356, the Black Prince commanded an English army of roughly 6,000 men against a French force of at least 10,000, possibly as many as 16,000. The French had learned something from Crécy. Many of their knights fought dismounted, trying to avoid the vulnerability that cavalry had shown against archers, but they still had to advance uphill, across broken ground into arrow fire, and the result was another devastating English victory. This time, the French losses included King John II himself, captured along with his youngest son and dozens of nobles. John would spend 4 years in captivity in England before a ransom was finally arranged. The capture of a reigning monarch was a diplomatic and military catastrophe for France. The ransom agreed upon in the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 was 3 million gold écus, an enormous sum that France struggled to pay. The treaty also ceded significant French territory to England. Edward renounced his claim to the French throne but gained sovereign control over Gascony and other territories. For a few years, it looked like England had won the 100 Years' War. They controlled significant French territory. They had defeated French armies repeatedly. They had captured the French king. But the war would continue, on and off, until 1453. The English would win most of the major battles, largely by continuing to use the tactical system proven at Crécy. The French would eventually win the war by avoiding those battles, using sieges and raids instead of seeking open combat, and by gradually improving their military capabilities to the point where they could challenge England effectively. One of the fascinating aspects of studying Crécy and its aftermath is seeing how long it took for military tactics to adapt to the longbow's dominance. You might think that after Crécy, no commander would ever again send cavalry charging uphill into massed archers. But at Poitiers 10 years later, that's essentially what happened again, and at Agincourt in 1415, nearly 70 years after Crécy, French cavalry made the same mistake yet again, with similar results. Why did this keep happening? Part of the answer lies in the social and cultural values of medieval nobility. Knights were raised from childhood to believe in the supremacy of cavalry, warfare. Their entire social identity was bound up in their role as mounted warriors. Chivalric literature glorified individual combat, noble deeds, and cavalry charges. Suggesting that dismounted peasants with bows could be more effective than mounted knights wasn't just a tactical heresy, it was a social one. The French nobility couldn't accept that their entire way of life, their justification for their privileged position in society, could be defeated by commoners using unchivalrous weapons, so they kept trying to prove it wasn't true. Each time they failed, because the tactical reality was clear. Massed missile fire from defensive positions could defeat cavalry charges, but acknowledging that reality meant acknowledging that the social order itself might need to change, and that was too much for most medieval nobles to accept. There's also a practical factor. The longbow's dominance only worked under specific conditions. The archers needed good defensive positions. They needed time to dig in and prepare. They needed to be protected by men-at-arms so cavalry couldn't simply ride around them and attack from the flanks or rear. And they needed favourable terrain. If French commanders could force the English to fight on flat, open ground without prepared positions, the longbow's advantage would be much reduced. The problem was that English commanders, having learned these lessons, refused to fight under unfavourable conditions. They chose their ground carefully. They prepared their positions, and if they couldn't get favourable terms, they avoided battle entirely. This is why most of the 100 Years' War wasn't fought through pitched battles like Crécy. It was fought through sieges, raids, skirmishes, and economic warfare. The major battles happened when one side couldn't avoid them, usually because they were defending a specific location, or because political pressure forced them to fight. The technological competition between armour and arrows also played out over decades. After Crécy, armour design increasingly focused on deflecting arrows rather than just resisting penetration. Curved surfaces that would cause arrows to glance off. Ridges and grooves that strengthened key areas. Better quality steel with more consistent properties. By the 1500s, the best full-plate armour could resist longbow arrows fairly reliably, at all but close range. But this armour was enormously expensive. A complete suit of high-quality plate armour cost as much as a small estate. Only the wealthiest nobles could afford it, and it was heavy and restrictive, requiring significant strength and training to fight effectively while wearing it. So while improved armour reduced the longbow's effectiveness against the best-equipped opponents, it didn't eliminate the weapon's utility. Most soldiers couldn't afford top-quality armour, and even well-armoured knights were vulnerable at weak points, especially from arrows coming from multiple directions. The counter to massed archery eventually came not from better armour, but from different tactics and weapons. Pike formations, standing in dense blocks with 18-foot pikes projecting outward, could resist cavalry charges without needing missile support. Artillery, improving throughout the 15th century, could suppress archers from beyond their effective range. And eventually firearms provided missile fire that could penetrate armour and required less training than longbows. But in 1346, these solutions were decades or centuries in the future. At Crécy, the longbow reigned supreme, and European warfare was transformed. The battle's influence extended beyond military tactics. It affected art, literature, and social attitudes. English archers became national heroes. Ballads and songs celebrated their victories. The figure of Robin Hood, the skilled archer fighting against oppression, gained new popularity. Meanwhile, in France, there was soul-searching and recrimination. How had they lost so badly? Who was to blame? Some French chroniclers tried to minimise the defeat or excuse it through claims of English treachery. Others acknowledged the tactical superiority of the English system, but argued it was unchivalrous and contrary to proper warfare. A few recognised that French military doctrine needed fundamental reform. The arguments continued for generations. Modern historical analysis of Crécy focuses on several key factors that explain the English victory. First, the choice and preparation of ground. Edward selected a position that maximised his advantages and minimised French strengths. The slope, the terraces, the protected flanks, all of these factors channeled the French attack into killing zones where archers could concentrate their fire. Second, the coordination between archers and men-at-arms. The archers broke up French attacks and reduced their momentum. The men-at-arms then finished off anyone who reached the English line. Each element supported the other, creating a combined arms system more effective than either could be alone. Third, training and discipline. The English archers and men-at-arms maintained their positions and followed their orders, despite hours of combat and multiple French charges. The men-at-arms, who were themselves knights and nobles accustomed to fighting on horseback, had the discipline to fight on foot in defensive positions instead of seeking individual glory through charges. Fourth, logistics and preparation. The English had adequate supplies of arrows, well-maintained equipment, and a plan that had been communicated to all units. The French, by contrast, attacked with incomplete preparations, without their crossbowmen's shields, and without a clear tactical plan beyond charge the enemy. Fifth, leadership. Edward commanded from a position where he could see the entire battlefield. He made good decisions about when to commit reserves, when his son needed help, when to hold position. Philip, by contrast, seems to have had less control over his army. Units arrived piecemeal and attacked without coordination. These factors combined to create one of the most one-sided victories in medieval military history. But perhaps the most important factor was the simplest. The English had a weapon system that, under the right conditions, could deliver overwhelming firepower. The longbow, in the hands of trained archers, shooting from prepared positions, was the medieval equivalent of a machine gun. It could lay down suppressive fire that made enemy movement suicidal, and the English had 7,000 of them at Crécy, all shooting at once. The battle that began with French confidence and English anxiety ended with French catastrophe and English triumph. It was the day the longbow first proved it could shatter not just a cavalry charge, but an entire military doctrine. The charge of the French knights at Crécy is often described in modern accounts as courageous but foolish. Medieval sources are more conflicted. From the French perspective, the knights had done their duty. They had charged the enemy repeatedly despite terrible casualties. They had shown courage under fire. If they failed, it was because of bad fortune, poor coordination, or the unchivalrous tactics of their enemies. From the English perspective, they had simply used their resources intelligently. They had taken a weapon that their nation had developed and trained for, deployed it well, and achieved victory through preparation and discipline. Both perspectives contained truth. The French knights were indeed courageous. Charging into arrow fire, watching your comrades die around you, and still pressing forward takes extraordinary bravery. But courage without tactical sense is just gallantry leading to pointless death. The English were indeed intelligent in their use of the longbow, but they were also fortunate in having terrain and conditions that favoured their tactics. If the battle had been fought on flat ground in dry weather, the results might have been different. What's undeniable is that Crécy represented a turning point. After this battle, the longbow was recognised across Europe as a weapon of strategic importance. English military reputation was established, and the French understood that they needed to adapt their tactics or face repeated defeats. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw both sides dealing with the costs. The French buried their dead, or, more often, left them to be buried by locals. The English counted their minimal casualties and thanked God for their victory. Edward sent messengers to England announcing the triumph. He displayed captured French banners and arms. He made generous gifts to his nobles and commanders. And then he moved on to besiege Calais, capitalising on his victory before French morale and organisation could recover. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the 100 Years' War. It influenced military thinking for centuries. The idea that well-trained, infantry with missile weapons could defeat heavy cavalry became accepted doctrine. The value of defensive positions, prepared ground, and combined arms tactics was reinforced, and the importance of training, discipline, and intelligent deployment of forces over simple numerical superiority was demonstrated. In modern terms, we might say that Crécy showed the importance of force multipliers. The terrain multiplied the effectiveness of the English position. The longbows multiplied the firepower each archer could deliver. The training multiplied the effectiveness of each individual soldier. These multipliers added up to give a smaller English army the ability to defeat a much larger French force. Military theorists still study Crécy today, not just for its historical importance, but for the timeless lessons it teaches about warfare, preparation, morale, coordination, and the danger of fighting the last war, of using tactics that worked in the past against an enemy who has found ways to counter them. For the French knights who survived, Crécy was a trauma that many never recovered from. They had seen their friends and brothers cut down by peasants. They had witnessed the complete failure of tactics and training that had worked for generations. Some quit military service entirely. Others became obsessed with finding ways to defeat English archers, leading to the gradual evolution of French tactics over the following decades. For English archers, Crécy was validation. They had proven their worth in the most dramatic way possible. Their status in English society rose. Archery became even more popular and prestigious. The longbow became a symbol of English military might, featured in art, literature, and national identity. The weapon itself would remain in English military service for another 2.5 centuries. The last major battle where English longbowmen played a significant role was probably Flodden Field in 1513, where English archers helped defeat a Scottish army. Even after firearms became standard military equipment, some English units maintained archery capability well into the 16th century. But by the mid-1600s, the longbow had finally been fully replaced by firearms. The reasons were practical. Muskets, while less accurate and slower to reload than longbows, could be learned in a fraction of the time. An army could train musketeers in weeks or months. Training longbowmen required years. As armies grew larger and warfare became more industrial, the longbow's advantages couldn't overcome its training requirements. The last military use of longbows was probably during the English Civil War of the 1640s, where a few units reportedly used them, though their effectiveness was minimal against pike and shot formations. Today, the longbow survives as a sporting weapon and historical artifact. Modern archers shoot traditional longbows in competitions and for recreation. Archaeological research continues to uncover longbows from historical sites, including the Mary Rose, a warship that sank in 1545 with over 100 longbows and thousands of arrows aboard. Analysis of these artifacts, along with studies of skeletal remains showing the distinctive deformities of longbowmen, has helped historians understand the weapon's capabilities and the physical demands of using it. The Battle of Crécy remains one of the most studied engagements in military history. It represents a clear example of tactical innovation defeating established doctrine, of preparation and position overcoming numerical superiority, and of a weapon system optimized for specific conditions achieving dramatic success. Standing on the ridge at Crécy today, now peaceful farmland, it's difficult to imagine the slaughter that occurred there in 1346. The gentle slope that gave English archers such advantage seems unremarkable. The terraces that broke up cavalry charges are barely noticeable. But on August 26th of that year, this ridge was the site of one of history's most one-sided battles. 7,000 English and Welsh archers stood here and sent a storm of arrows into advancing French cavalry. Thousands of knights, the finest warriors of their age, died trying to climb this slope. And when the sun set on that bloody day, European warfare had changed forever. The age of cavalry supremacy was ending. The longbow had spoken, and it had transformed medieval warfare with a sound like thunder, like snow falling, like death on the wind.